Kicking off the list at number 10, the Battle of Hastings. Okay, we look back at jesters and jugglers of the Dark Ages, and we laugh, we chuckle a little bit, rightfully so. The earliest accounts of the Fool go back to the 11th century. It was one of the best jobs to have, despite how, Game of Thrones made jesters look. It was an honorable job. The Fool's payment also was no joke, my friend. Roland Le Petour was rewarded with 30 acres of land from King Henry II, so long as he kept farting and juggling. Not a bad gig. Don't let looks deceive you, however. During the Battle of Hastings in October 1066, it had one of the most badass minstrels I have ever heard of. No jokes with this guy, that's for sure. Now for starters, this was the same battle where William the Conqueror defeated King Harold. Historic, of course, one of the bloodiest battles in history. How it all began though. William's minstrel, his fool, sang at English troops while he was juggling his sword around. He was singing, he was doing a little show, he's juggling and saying some probably nasty things. That's when an English soldier came forward to challenge Taillefer, and then he was promptly killed. And so began one of the bloodiest battles in history. Yeah, he taunted them until they made the first move. Is that allowed? I'd be so upset. I'd be upset. Number 9, Malin Matsdaughter. On part 1, we had a few cases where women were found guilty of practicing witchcraft. Of course. Now this was a common theme for the Dark Ages, sadly, but it's one thing for a town to randomly turn against you out of the blue because they're spooked, whatever the case, but imagine your family, someone who actually knows you. That's exactly what happened to Malin Matsdaughter. She was a Swedish widow, and her own daughter told everybody in town that she was a witch. Yeah, she was the last victim of the Great Swedish Witch Hunt in 1676, also known as the Great Noise. Malin goes down in history because 1, it was thankfully one of the last, but 2, she never admitted. No way. She's like, nope, I'm not a witch. That's it. She didn't cry out in pain, she didn't beg for forgiveness, anything like that. She said it was all hogwash and she stood by it quietly. Her daughter was actually later found guilty of perjury, so she too met a similar fate. Don't talk smack about your mothers. Number 8, toilet trouble. What a transition. Here on Bumblebee, we've talked a lot of smack about ancient toilets. God, they were so bad, I can't. I would never. I would hold it for 36 years. Apparently, these things could also take lives. Yeah, in the middle of the summer, nobody around you, you could have been a victim to a medieval toilet. Yeah, how does that happen? Let's talk about it. In 1523, a Cambridge baker named George Duncan, he went out to the cesspit and the guy sadly fell in. Now, normally you could just crawl back out, sure, but this fateful day, Duncan was quite intoxicated. The poor guy suffocated in his own. What a horrible way to go out. One of the worst ways to go out. Number 7, pole vaulting. This is one of the most impressive sports to exist. We do not talk about pole vaulting enough. Pole vaulting is insane. Just guy with a stick over a building? Are you kidding? That's Mario physics. Today we admire athletes like Sweden's Armand Mondo Duplantis. This guy broke the world record at the 2020 Olympics. He leaped over 6 meters with a stick. Back in the Dark Ages, however, this was not a sport. No, this was your commute. The day pole vaulting was born was supposedly Christmas Day, December 25th, 1521. A Christmas miracle. Now we have pole vaulting. A laborer named Robert Baker was heading home from the church. It was Christmas, he was tired, he decided to take a shortcut over a pond, so he grabbed a long pole and voila, he just made it. Now, don't try this. We don't recommend this as a travel option, obviously, because later on, Baker's pole ended up snapping mid-leap and then he ended up drowning. Sadly, yeah, the poor guy bridged to Terabithia himself, so I wouldn't recommend pole vaulting. Number 6, the iron chair. Not to be confused with the Iron Throne, although I'm sure that seat isn't quite comfortable either. I have a funny back, I gotta sit, ooh. There we go. Heard a crack in the mic. The iron chair was a device used in medieval punishments. Yeah, it sounds crazy to say it, but this one seems more tame compared to some of the other devices used, Like I mentioned the ducking stool in part 1. That was bad. This one's more Viking. This one's actually pretty brutal. These spikes don't look like much upon first glance, but they easily can poke through your skin. The chair is actually designed to pierce through the skin without hitting any vital organs. So you had to sit still. Definitely had to sit still. I actually lied to you guys. The more I explain this one, the more I think it's the worst of the worst. I guess this is why they call it the Dark Ages. Oh my gosh. Number 5, Bridget Bishop. In 1692, 500 people lost their lives due to smallpox. This happened after Europeans brought the disease to North America, and then in result you would get covered in these sores, like pimple-like bubbles. It was horrible, it was really painful. So rather than recognize the situation as symptoms from a disease, the fine people of Salem thought, no, they're probably witches. I think they're witches who can float and do magic, for sure. That seems more realistic, right? Yeah, for sure. The small Massachusetts village began this wave of hysteria with two young women, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. They started to show signs of this disease. They were convulsing, acting strange, obviously being, extremely ill. The village doctor, William Greggs, just said at this point that they were bewitched. He's like, here's a word. And they're like, great, that did nothing. He's like, okay. And then other villagers slowly started to show similar symptoms because, well, that's how science works. But at the time, they believed Bridget was the first ever witch. The reason they kicked off this entire Salem witch hunt was Bridget Bishop and her sickness. So over the next few months, around 150 more were convicted, all meeting their similar horrible fate on Gallows Hill. Maybe it was Bridget Bishop, or maybe it was just rye disease. Yeah. Who would have thunk? Now it's referred to as St. Anthony's fire. You convulse, you experience delusions, everything's similar. It feels like there's bugs under your skin, which is the worst thing I've ever read in my entire life. But these doctors didn't know that at the time. Everyone thought they were all just cursed witches. They were not cursed, they just needed help. It's really just that. Oddly enough, in May 1693, just 1 year later, the Salem witch trials abruptly ended. Weird! Did the town of Salem run out of witches, or did they just run out of contaminated rye bread? I vote the latter. It's probably the latter. Number 4, steal. Don't steal. Please. While it's next to impossible to prove your marriage to somebody back in the medieval days, imagine proving that you're innocent, that you didn't just steal an apple and run it through a village, right? It's also really tough to catch a thief. No alarms, no cameras. It was literally like Assassin's Creed. Just throw your hood up, grab an apple, and then sprint into the woods for 30 minutes and hope for the best. Hope an arrow doesn't go brrr on the way out. That's really it. The markup for stealing was also pretty wild for the time. It kind of had to be. If you stole something worth half a mark in Danish-controlled parts of England, you would be fined 80 times that whatever you stole. So you better be a track star. You better have one of those pole vaults handy, my friend. Each ruler had a different way of dealing with theft. It wasn't all the same. So you may have gotten off lucky sometimes. Sometimes, maybe, depends. Again, I'm talking about a time where people believed in witches. People who made ducking stools. They made fun new methods for punishing one another. So, who's to really say? But depending on where you got caught, you might lose a body part or you might just get a slap on the wrist. The reality is, more often than not, anything over half a mark often resulted in death as a punishment. Number 3, coffins. Now when you hear the word coffin, odds are you're thinking of vampires or, some dude like this in a wooden box, uncomfortable. Coffins in the medieval times are a little bit different. They're outside the front of the castles, these cages. They're usually, hanging off of some dainty, like streetlight looking thing. Usually a crow is pecking away at a skeleton. It's haunting. Those cages are coffins. The victim was placed inside said cage, and the period of time they're kept there depends on your crime. Now, of course, people were left there to die a lot, but instead of sharp metal or a rusty chair, people would burn in the sun and then starve to death until animals or birds finished them off. But here's the kicker. Yeah, it gets worse, believe it or not. While these coffins would be placed in open, hot areas, a lot of the time, more often than not, they would be placed in public areas. So crowds would gather. They would talk and then throw stuff at the victim while they were serving their time day after day. Even though you weren't sentenced to death, the town may just vote otherwise. Number 2, animal witches. Okay, if you have any pets watching this video, get them out of the room. Cover their little fluffy ears for this. I don't want them getting any ideas. One of the craziest things about looking back to the Salem witch trials has to be that animals were also found guilty of witchcraft. Yeah, like a pig went to trial. Actual court. Grown adults would show up for animals. I'm dead serious. They would accuse animals of witchcraft and wizardry. Yep. I wonder what house this pig would belong into. I vote Slytherin. No better sous chef than a golden retriever, in my humble opinion. But to be fair, Air Bud played like 9 different sports, so, it could have happened. On the official list of victims from the Salem witch trials, 2 cats were accused, as well as 2 dogs. That's unbelievable. These villagers, their mindset was, if their pet was behaving strangely, it must mean that they're working with witches in the middle of the night. Why, of course, why else? What, are they hungry or thirsty? No, they're for sure witches. Villagers believed witches traveled at night not by broom per se, but by riding on the back of their pets. Yeah, it wasn't just dogs either. They thought that witches rode cows, pigs, wolves, dogs, even turtles. Imagine a witch riding a turtle. She would be so late to that cauldron cook-off. And finally, number 1, Giles Corey. So after part 1 and now part 2, we can safely conclude that the Salem witch trials were a bunch of bull. Yeah, a bit of bogus, I'd say. Out of the 27 people who had their lives taken away from them during the 1692 trials, 19 were hanged, 17 passed away in prison while serving their sentence, you know, being a witch and all. But the very last victim, Giles Corey, he refused to plead either innocence or guilty, and the law at the time states that you can't be tried otherwise. So they had to try and punish it out of Giles. They had to try and get him to confess so that they can take his land. Yeah, they used brutal measures as well. They laid a heavy board on top of the 81-year-old Giles Corey, and then over the course of 2 days, boulders were slowly added, making the weight more and more unbearable. They were hoping at this point that Giles would admit something, but every time they asked him anything about being a witch, Giles responded with the same sentence. He just responded with, "More weight." Yeah, keep 'em coming, he says. What a champ. After 2 days of this punishment, this excruciating pain, Corey did in fact pass away, still in full possession of his estate, which then went to his son-in-law. Now, if he had been found guilty, the government would have taken that from him. So he sadly did the best thing he could have long-term for his family at this point, by not admitting. I mean, he had to deal with some of the dumbest and most cruel people that ever walked Salem. It's pretty much just that. Nothing to do with Giles or his choices. It's just, hey, check out how insane this town was. Yep, that's history. Kicking off the list at number 10, the Heretic's Fork. Ah yes, I like sporks. This fork, I don't like. Another horrible thing for your neck right off the bat, here we go. The Heretic's Fork was designed so that nobody has to physically harm the victim, which is one of the worst in my opinion, because now it's on them to get hurt from this punishment, and then no one has to even be responsible. A double-sided medieval fork, an old rusty, horrible fork, would be attached to your neck with a belt, anything that keeps the fork steady, you name it. So now the victim has to keep their neck straight, or else the obvious and horrible would happen. Ugh, I hate it. I have a long neck too. That would be a long commute down. I don't talk about punishments enough on this channel. Some of them I don't think I'm even allowed to be honest. The Heretic's Fork is no joke. We could thank the Spanish Inquisition for this device. Yeah, it was used from 1478 to 1834, most often to get the victim to confess to crimes. There's usually a Latin phrase on these heretic forks. That phrase is abiro, translating to I recant. If you find a medieval fork in that third drawer down and it says that in Latin, get out of the house, that's all I'm saying. Number 9, mob football. Ah yes, some medieval footy, let's do it. Growing up, I was lousy with footwork. I couldn't kick a ball for the life of me. Back in the 12th century, I would have been doomed, would have been game over. Back in those days, it was called football because you played this game on your feet. You didn't necessarily have to use your feet to further said ball. And also the goalposts were sometimes miles away, so it made sense to use a throw or two. Also, don't stress about picking favorites for your team. Each side consisted of 300 to 500 players, so plenty of room for you and yours. I also forgot the most important rule, of course. You can fight each other. Yeah, you can full on have a brawl, whatever, no rules. It comes to no surprise that there were a few casualties, but finally this game was banned come 1359. King Edward III punished those who played ball by 6 days of imprisonment. Yeah, it turns out when there's a bubonic plague and you're at war, maybe fighting each other and breaking bones isn't the best way to kill time, you know? Maybe go and hit the archery arena. Go shoot some arrows. Go practice, go break some pots. I don't know, whatever Link does in his off time. Number 8. Don't blow it. This one rings a familiar bell. This is pretty humorous, I'm not gonna lie. We'll lighten it up a bit. Back in the 12th century, horse racing was born in a Suffolk town called Newmarket. Once King James I got set up in 1606, the sport became more widely known, and it was now a major form of entertainment as well. Eventually, laws had to be put in place to protect said prized pupils. Those horses were famous at this point, so if you think you can walk around the streets and, I don't know, blow your nose, think again, pal. That's illegal. Yes, it was once illegal to blow your nose in the streets because officials didn't want horses getting ill. In fact, if you were outside sick at all, you had to pay a fine if you were caught. Yeah, imagine you're on your way to the doctors while you're sick, then you get pulled over for a temperature check. You're like, oh, not today, please. Oh no. Number 7, forbidden shoes. 15th century shoes. Look at these fancy things, come on. Imagine you have to help carry groceries, but you could only use these. Wouldn't be done. Krakows, or pikes, these were the talk of every town. The longer the toe extended, the more wealthy you seemed. I'm talking like 6 inches sometimes. See Mike's feet? Guy's huge. Dudes were tripping over their feet sometimes. It was crazy. Most importantly, the common folk were starting to look like royalty. Yeah, how dare you? How dare you look like the English crown, you poser? Finally, a law was passed in 1463. No knight under the rank of a lord, esquire, or gentleman, nor any other person shall wear any shoes or boots having spikes or points which exceed the length of 2 inches. That lasted until 1604. Yeah, God forbid you're wearing your dad's pikes and then you get busted. Too long, pal. Over 2 inches? Going to the slammer. The punishment for a long pike was a fine of 3 shillings and 4 pence. Do I have that? Oh, shoot. That's like 150 bucks today, give or take. Imagine that, all because of your shoes. All because you thought you were rich. Yeah, get a grip, peasant. Go change back into your Birkenstocks. Number 6. Solitary confinement. This is a kind of punishment that still exists in our modern society. It's honestly one of the worst because of the type of psychological distress that it causes. Here we go. Basically, this form of punishment involves a prisoner living in a single cell with little to no meaningful contact with anybody else. That's the whole punishment. Now, the isolation that solitary confinement can create can be life-altering for people. It's really bad. There are many stories about people being locked up for so long that eventually they just forget about their families entirely. Some people have gone away to solitary confinement for so long that once they're out, they can no longer speak. Isn't that crazy? Solitary confinement and the negative effects it has on one person is becoming a wider topic of conversation today because of said effects on a person's mental well-being, and it's a topic for a lot of human rights organizations. Yeah, rightfully so. Can't mess with the brain. Back in medieval times, solitary confinement was even worse. It was just a room made of stones, it was pitch black, it was freezing cold. It was also below some horrible stinky castle, and most of the time you weren't really alone. No, there were some hairy creatures nibbling away at your toes, but I'll save that for the end. That's pretty horrible. Number 5, medieval tennis. Not to be confused with Mario Tennis, although that's probably just as hard to play, if we're being honest. Medieval tennis was introduced in 1485, and just like the other insane ball game we covered today, this too was eventually banned. Yeah, that's how you know it's a good one. If you weren't a noble, you couldn't play tennis. You weren't allowed to. You could only play if it was Christmas. Yeah, so you better write that on your wish list. Many believe tennis was disrupting labor and encouraging violence and gambling. Yeah, tennis encouraging violence. Imagine that. Tennis was eventually referred to as the sport of kings because both King Henry VII and VIII were actually pretty good at it. Yeah, they're like Venus and Serena Williams of medieval times, only not athletic and not nice and also not good at tennis. I mean, why else would you ban the sport, really? Let's be honest. Number 4, one meal deal. Okay, so obviously food was a little sparse back in the medieval age. Uber Eats wasn't around yet, but you know what was? Disease. Yeah, and worse things, yeah. The life expectancy wasn't great, but even so, laws were still put in place so the common folk wouldn't overindulge. Yeah, hey, I know times are rough, but can you stress eat a little less? Thanks. Yeah, you just look a little gross. Yeah, King Henry VIII needs his 9th bowl of soup, so please stop. They were actually upset that the common folk were matching the lifestyle from higher ups. Nothing to do with supply, really, just appearance. In 1336, a law banned people from eating more than 2 courses. Soup also counted as one meal, not a sauce. Believe me, they asked. Again, the only exception here at the time, mid-1300s, was Christmas Day. Then you get to eat and have fun and play tennis. Yeah, the one day you can overindulge is the same day you can play tennis. They're like, oh, I can't. Now I can't. Number 3, the thumbscrew. A little less graphic, but still a horrible specific device used for punishments, dare I say. The thumbscrew was used in the Middle Ages to get somebody to spill information or confess to a crime they probably didn't even commit in the first place. We didn't have anything else to detect lies, so these soldiers would make horrible devices to get you to spill the beans, or lie and say you did, and then we can go home. This was one of the best cases, really, the thumbscrew. It was also known as the thumbkin, and it would slowly crush your fingers, obviously. Just looking at it, you're like, does it do what I think it does? Yeah, it does. This, of course, turned into the knee crusher, or even worse, the head crusher, which I obviously don't need to explain. Yeah, the classic medieval fork. Now they're getting creative, advancing their gadgets. Nice, we love it. I can't even imagine the knee crusher. That alone, no thank you. Let's move on. Number 2, the cake test. Of all the nonsensical tests performed during the Salem witch trials that we covered in part 1 and 2, this one takes the cake. Yeah, pun intended. I did that on purpose. It sounds delicious, but in reality, it was just spreading the disease even more. This was a popular method of seeking out witchcraft in England as well. See, they would make a cake out of, well, you guessed it, rye flour. Remember that, rye flour. And then they would add a little bit of urine from the accused witch. Yeah, I'm more of a chocolate cake guy myself, not a big fan of urine cake. But hey, who knows, maybe I'll change. But don't worry, nobody ate this cake, just an unfortunate village dog. Yeah, sad thing. They would feed this cake to a good boy, and then if the dog showed the same witchy symptoms, you know, being sick from said rye, then the town knew for sure that the accused was guilty. I just really wish one villager was like, maybe it's the pee. I'm just saying. Number 1, rats. Another Game of Thrones classic to finish off our horrible part 3. If you're a rat person, I know there's a lot of people who do tricks with their rats and stuff. That's great, but cover their little eyes for this one. This is horrible. Get them out of here. Rats were used as a medieval punishment. Where do I even start with this one? It was a punishment for the rats too, really. This is a 2-for-1 when it comes to pain. What was once called a rat trap involved a man being tied down to something, and then a metal enclosure or bucket being strapped to his abs or his chest. Inside this enclosure, there are rats, which the strapped down person can feel walking around in their skin. And then that's when the person instilled in the punishment begins heating the other side of the metal enclosure, and historically hot coals were usually placed on top, which of course very quickly creates a hot environment for the rats inside. And many of you see where I'm going already and you're like, ooh, yep, it's gonna happen. From here the rats begin to frantically search for a way out, the softest way out, because just like us they have survival instincts. And the metal enclosure is too hard to bite into, but a human's flesh, that's definitely not. Horrible, huh? Yeah, that's history. Kicking off the list at number 10, the disappearance of the Norse. I just watched The Northman and that was a great time. Highly recommend. Fantastic movie. I'm gonna start barking at dogs just like he did. That's how I'm gonna do it now. Norse mythology is fascinating yet of course mysterious. They settled in Greenland for over 400 years and they left quite the mark, I'd say, or maybe not as much as we'd think. We look at Norse history as violent and bearded and mighty, but Vikings, they were nice, okay? They invented hockey, they skied, women had a large amount of rights compared to what we often see on this channel, and even today in general. But one of life's greatest mysteries are where Greenland's Vikings went. They seemingly disappeared. The only remains are crumbling church walls that were used for barely 500 years. That's nothing. Archaeologists are still unsure what happened to the Norse population. Maybe it was a plague, maybe it was the Inuit, or perhaps they settled back in Europe. It's really hard to tell. Recent excavations provide hints that they settled in the West, most likely relying on trade to survive. So maybe they just followed the goods. But again, life's greatest mysteries. We have no idea. Number 9, Shroud of Turin. I can't believe it's taken me 4 parts to mention this. Let's go. This legendary cloth is dated back to the late 1200s, early 1300s, you know, that old time. This holy cloth appears to show the image of a man, presumably one J. Christ. It's 4 meters long and 1 meter wide, and it sits permanently in the Cathedral of Turin in northern Italy. So if you're in the area, go take a peek at what many believe to be the burial shroud in which Jesus was wrapped in, you know, after his crucifixion. Sometimes I wake up and I see the outline of my own face in the pillowcase and I think, is that Jesus? Who is this handsome chap right here? Covered in drool. So much drool. Number 8, keel hauling. Not to be confused with Kegels, although that also takes a great amount of work. Keel hauling was reserved for the worst of the worst at sea. Yeah, this is some high seas punishments. Here we go. This was used by pirates for sailors who disobeyed orders and whatnot. The victim would be suspended by a rope with rocks or weights around their ankles, and then they'd be lowered to the keel of the ship where, you know, all the ship barnacles and nasty stuff live. And then they would get dragged all around those, plus water pain and drowning. It's a lot. It's a deadly combination. Anything to do with barnacles or the sea, zero chance. I'm not messing with either of those. I'll tell you anything, Blackbeard, literally anything. Number 7, water punishments. Since we're on the topic, let's dive in a bit more. Pun intended. Taking a step away from the worst physical thing that one could possibly go through, let's look at how far the mind will go before it too breaks. Sensory deprivation, it's still around in today. In fact, there's many who pay for it, believe it or not. Yeah, a fun experience today is paying to lay in a dark tub full of salt and water and then floating. It's a magical experience, some would say. It's magical because your senses are powerful, especially combined with water. So the dripping machine, the water punishment, anything around that is just all bad, especially in medieval times. Ice cold water dripping on your forehead over and over and over for hours and hours. It's one of the worst and oldest punishments. Everybody's heard about this in some way, shape, or form. In medieval times, they would do it as well. The drops would be at different times too, so you couldn't predict it. You can't see right now, but my toes are wiggling. They're wiggling around in my Birkenstocks. In medieval times, they would tie you down and then using a horn, this big funnel, they would pour 9 pints of water in your mouth sometimes, yeah. Pain was a form of punishment. This was the normal at one point. I feel sick. I feel so sick. They would do that with wine sometimes too. They'd make people, jesters, chug wine. That was in Game of Thrones one episode. Number 6, the breaking wheel. Okay, this one isn't even creative. This is just bad and like just humans at their worst. The breaking wheel is literally just a large disc, a pirate ship wheel almost, where somebody is tied to it and then everyone else just hammers them over and over. They just beat the shit out of them. But of course, since we're talking about medieval times, everything has to be a show. It has to be, some guy's always doing this in medieval times when it's like a guy being punished horribly. He's like, haha, it's so stupid. So once the accused was beaten and then presumed dead, the wheel would lift up and then turn, to show everybody what's up, what happens if you steal a loaf of bread, I guess. The other way is they would tie a person to the wheel and then continue to rotate it. All the while the ropes would get tighter and tighter around your body. Yeah, it's kind of like the rack, but with a twist. Pun intended. Number 5, the Great Fire of London. Back in the 1600s, London saw quite the blaze. The Great Fire of 1666. Now, in the Bible, it references the number 666 as the number of the beast, living, in the depths below and all that good stuff. So many Christians in Europe back in the 1600s believed that the world was going to end in 1666, kind of like our version of the Mayan calendar debacle back in 2012. Well, the thing is, the Great Fire actually did happen that year. Yeah, it happened September 2nd to September 5th. The blaze destroyed the entire city, including 87 churches and 13,000 homes. See, many saw this, of course, as said prophecy to the end of the world coming true, but with all the property damage, the death toll for this great fire was relatively low, as only 10 people died. That's less than half the lives lost in the Salem witch trials, so could be worse. Not great, but surprisingly low for what you would think, looking at this. Number 4, Greek fire. More fire facts coming in hot. Puns, a lot of puns today. A blazing mystery, this one is. Okay, Greek fire had scholars and pyromaniacs stumped for decades. This powerful incendiary weapon was used during the 7th century. The Byzantine Empire was on the top of their game with this one. Imagine being the first human to weaponize fire. How terrifying is that? That's horrible. It's been referred to as Roman fire or sticky fire. Many resources suggest that water made this situation worse. The Greek fire was only enhanced with water. That was the magic back then. The trick here was using combustible substances like sulfur, petroleum, all that bad stuff. They would blast it from a safe distance to other ships. The only way to put out Greek fire was copious amounts of sand, vinegar, and urine. Yeah, the third one, no problem, we got lots of that on board. Especially when a Greek fire syringe is facing your ship. Yeah, lots of urine on standby, just say the word. I'm shaking with fear. Number 3, Viking funerals. Now I know this isn't really messed up, but I really wish we still did these today. This would be a spectacle. Vikings would do funerals in one of two ways. Both were pretty epic to witness back in the day. One, they would bury the body, the classic. They would leave stone circles around the shallow graves that they dug, or they would do burial mounds or grave fields, usually after a large battle. Vikings were pagan, so they believed that the more smoke during a cremation, the better. That was their way of reaching the afterlife. Again, beautiful, ceremonic, that's not a word. Boats also symbolize safe passage to said afterlife in Norse mythology, so Vikings would shape these stones around the grave like a ship, or these mounds would be shaped like a boat of some sorts. How beautiful is that? But high-ranking Norsemen, they would be buried with their boats. In 834 AD, the Oseberg ship burial honored two women. This ship vessel was 70 feet long and 17 feet wide. There's 15 oars on each side. It was quite the spectacle. It was discovered in Norway on a farm. So the whole shooting an arrow while they're at sea thing, yeah, it wasn't as common as we believe. Because if you missed, you just gave away the Oseberg. And you botched a funeral at the same time. Way to go. So more often than not, they would do these ceremonies on land with the arrow and the fire. Which is good news for me, because I have terrible aim. If I was alive back then, I would have missed every time. Number 2, not so great flood. This one is most likely how we'll meet our collective demise. I'm gonna call that. Back in the 1500s, German mathematician and astrologer Johann Stoffler predicted that a great flood would cover the world and result, of course, in the death of humanity as we know it. Haha, great. He even pinpointed a date. How specific is that? We love warnings. We love heads up here. The date was apparently February 25th, 1524. This was when all the planets would be aligned under Pisces, a water sign, so naturally they thought there would be a large flood. I see the connection, I get it, I'm not totally off board here. Soon after he made said prediction, hundreds of pamphlets were spread around warning of this great flood, and as you can imagine, this caused a lot of panic. A German nobleman believed this, maybe a bit too much, so he gathered all of his resources to build a 3-story ark. Yeah, he went full on Noah for this doomsday prediction. The guy had a 3-story ark built. The amount of effort in that, come on. In the end though, thankfully, when the day of February 25th, 1524 arrived, it did rain, but it was a light one at most, so there's no flooding going on here. Not yet, at least. And finally, number 1, the green-skinned children. This legend comes from the village of Woolpit in Suffolk, England. The story goes that in the 12th century, 2 children, a brother and a sister, just suddenly appeared in the village. Out of nowhere. And as their name suggests, they had green skin. Not blue. They weren't avatars. I checked twice. So obviously my first thought is aliens, for sure. When the children were first found, they were acting kind of sketchy, they seemed nervous, and were seemingly speaking gibberish. To be fair, they were discovered near a wolf pit, so that could explain the nervousness, right? But also, and most importantly, they were green. We're gonna focus on that one today. After they were found, they were taken back to the home of Sir Richard Ducking, where he of course offered them food, water, and shelter, all that good stuff. But they were all set. Yeah, and apparently they refused to eat. What's going on here? The only thing they decided to eat over the next few days were green beans that they consumed straight out of the ground. Yeah, raw, there we go. A couple of green beans, eating green beans. What a sight. As the children lived with Richard over the following years, he taught them how to speak, and once they had the English tongue down, they told Richard that they're actually inhabitants of the land St. Martin, who is regarded with peculiar veneration in the country which gave us birth. And that they only vaguely remember what happened before they arrived on our planet. So yeah, they're from another planet, and not a lot makes sense here. They're with their father hearing the St. Edmund's bell chiming, and then all of a sudden they were just teleported to this field in England. So, parallel universes, I guess they're real too, who knew? Kicking off the list at number 10, black cats. Yeah, we'll start this dark list off a little slowly, we'll ease our way into the witch trials. You see a black cat cross in front of you, what's the first thing you think? Bad luck, bad omens, bad stuff? Does that cat belong to anyone? Maybe I should take it home and take care of it. Well, in 1232, Pope Gregory IX, he exposed a cult of witches in northern Germany. Yeah, he wrote an expose called Vox in Rama. He went in deep, he knew some of the ritual words used at these cult meetings. He knew everything, which in my opinion, a little fishy, right? This guy knows a lot. Were you involved, my dude? What's going on? He exposed the happenings, including the involvement of one black cat. They would oddly kiss it and worship it. Now at first when reading about this, I was like, oh no, the cat, what's gonna happen? No, it's good. It was cat worship in this way, which is odd, but better historically. The Pope did afterwards send hunters out to eliminate any cat in sight, so it is pretty dark and scandalous. The level of cats in the mid-1200s was almost at an extinct level. Pretty horrible, right? If only we had all those cats later on in 1347 when, rats carrying the Black Death arrived. We definitely could have used a few cats, but witches. Number 9, flat earth. Okay, it's 2022. We can watch live footage right now from the International Space Station just whipping around us. We can fly to Australia in this day and age. We can have a window seat and watch the entire commute. But there's still a good amount of people today that believe that the earth is flat. How shocking is that? How scandalous indeed. The same guys who believed women were witches were also like, oh, of course the earth isn't flat. That's crazy. How conflicting is that historically? We think any time before Columbus, especially back in the Dark Ages, we have this general idea that they didn't know anything, specifically the scale of the planet or even the universe for that matter. We're still launching telescopes into space to record the edges of the galaxy. There's so much we don't know today, yet there's still flat earthers. Shocking enough, the Middle Ages didn't see many of those. In the 13th century, navigators were regarding the earth as a sphere, with 4 cardinal points as well. Even going back further, looking at ancient Roman days, in 77 AD, Pliny the Elder, the ancient philosopher, also agreed on the Earth's shape. It was common knowledge, dare I say, even in the Dark Ages. So if you know any flat earthers, send them this link, and then also send them a link of the ISS. I don't know. Number 8, red hair problems. Alright, if you're a redhead out there, I'm sorry about this one. I had to talk about it. History can be ugly sometimes, and more often than not, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Historically, urine has been used for the greater good. Teeth whitening, Roman laundry days, urine makes leather soft. We get it. The Spanish Inquisition brought with them the idea that red hair was a sign of witchcraft. Yeah, the sign of the devil himself. The manuscripts published at that time about redheads too didn't help. They were horrible. The Proverbs of Alfred warns against having a redhead as a friend. And then another manuscript, Secretum Secretorum, warns against using redheads as advisors. Yeah, not even a work friend. Sorry, Big Chud. 14th century manuscripts tell me that you're working for the devil, so now we can't talk to you, all because you have nice hair. Another manuscript from the 14th century believes that redheads are rarely faithful in both friendships and romantic relationships. Yeah, if you have a redhead partner, don't go through their phone, okay? Don't listen to the Spanish Inquisition, okay? Don't listen to the devil. They're not working for the devil, okay? They're just fine. They're redheads. Freckles as well. If you had freckles in the Middle Ages, Good game. Number 7, Macbeth's Curse. Every curse starts somewhere, okay? All you theater kids out there probably know about this one. I feel guilty talking about this. Here we go. There's a few things you can't say to an actor before a show, and oddly enough, good luck is one of them. Yeah, you're supposed to say break a leg. All these theater traditions you can't break, okay? You're about to go on and do Shakespeare and do like this huge monologue wearing funky shoes. You gotta be in the zone, okay? You gotta, it's like game day. Even actors have their playoff beards, you know what I mean? It's like a ritual, you gotta stick to it. This legend goes back to 1606, the time of Macbeth's first performance. The actor playing Lady Macbeth died right before the show, sadly, so Shakespeare had to step in and play the part himself. Now apparently at this time, a coven of witches cursed the show. Yeah, since then there's been tales of real daggers being used in the show accidentally instead of prop daggers. The Astor Place riot in New York City back in 1849, that was caused by rival actors both playing Macbeth in their respective productions. There's also countless amount of stories recalling botched performances of the play, but what do we think? Is this the case of being in your own head and we just never dropped it, or is the Macbeth curse real? I don't know. Coven of witches cursing plays. That sounds pretty medieval. I hope it's not real. That would suck. I just got cursed. Number 6, witch's curse. More curses. Let's do it. From the 1400s to the 1700s alone, there were around 50,000 individuals who were all found guilty of witchcraft and wizardry. And we all know what that meant. But how many of those were actual witches? Like really, was this a real thing? Were any of them actually found guilty? Was any of them the Red Woman from Game of Thrones? Like, did she do anything? We'll start with a woman named Mother Shipton. Mother Shipton, aka Ursula Southiel. She was a clairvoyant from the 16th century, England's greatest, if that. Her mother as well was a widely known witch, which is a little dark. But Ursula, she was good at her job. She was often compared to Nostradamus, so she was using her passed on abilities for the greater good. Again, greater good, the middle-aged greater good. She predicted the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, and she also predicted the internet. Yeah, in the 16th century, she predicted that thoughts around the world shall fly in the twinkling of an eye. It rhymes, so you know she was on a good streak. Mother Shipton actually passed away a peaceful death, believe it or not. She wasn't hunted down by a mob or anything like that. She was actually buried on unholy grounds in 1561, which is insanely bizarre for a witch at any time. And the fact that people compared her to Nostradamus and she wasn't, shocking. Dare I say, we have a good one. A nice good one for a halfway point. Number 5, Agnes Sampson. And now back to the dark stuff. This one's not as great. Turning the clocks now to 30 years after Mother Shipton, the general public isn't always so easy when it comes to clairvoyance. So around 1590, when King James VI, when he was ruling Scotland, this was an important time because the lovely Anne of Denmark-Norway, his wife, she was very much opposed to black magic or all that voodoo. She wasn't on board at all. During one commute back to Scotland, for example, the couple barely made it through a fierce storm. So King James VI, he was now convinced, because of his wife, that the storms were an outcome of black magic. Yeah, a witch cursed their commute. All because of a storm, they thought this, imagine that. So they charged one Agnes Sampson. The king and the queen all believed that these witches attended a coven on Halloween night, and that's what happened with their commute. So she was held prisoner until she confessed. And then at that point, she finally met her horrible fate. Her nonsensical, horrible fate. Number 4, plague bearer. Okay, if you think your job sucks, hear me out. The hot summer of July 1665. Okay, what do we do with all these poor souls who have been hit by said plague during the Dark Ages? You can't just hide them all in the catacombs this time, right? We can't just hide them in a random place. We don't have that. So a plague bearer is the person that you need. Church wardens would organize burials. This was a normal thing back in the 1600s, but when the plague hit, they had to change things up a bit. Now things were a little bit dangerous. If somebody had the plague, these guys would be responsible for transporting them far, far away and then burying them. Plague bearers, that's crazy. A church would then house these plagued souls far away from society. How grim is that? All because you got sick. But I mean, that's probably a good thing, all things considered, If there's anything we learned the past couple years, it's like, oh yeah, things spread. Just a little bit, including misinformation. Haha. Number 3, medieval barbers. A barber from the Middle Ages. Yeah, that title alone gives me the chills. If I have a toothache, I'm telling no one. That appointment's gonna suck, okay? Cavity, toothache, maybe you accidentally bit a rock, chipped the tooth, whatever. They would only pull it. Worst case, best case, your teeth are getting pulled no matter what. Yeah, barbers were responsible for cutting hair, pulling teeth, and bloodletting. The classic 3-in-1 appointment. Get it all done in 40 minutes or less. There you go. Keep the change, good sir, and a thing of ale. There you go. Get drunk, pull my teeth. Middle Ages. Back in the 1500s, patients were walking in with an arrow sticking out of them, right? Instead of cutting the tip off and then pulling it the opposite way, the arrow remover would cut into the injury, open it more, which would suck, and then it would hold it open. And then the barber would come in and then pull it out in his own barber way. Whatever his qualifications were, didn't really matter. He was a barber, he was also pulling arrows out of your back. So you would go in for a toothache and then you would leave with an amputated foot. You never know. Medieval barbers sucked all the time. Number 2, the ducking stool. This next one requires so much effort. I can't believe this was a real thing that real people did. The ducking stool was made to punish women involved in sexual activities. How dare they? How dare thou? Men were punished too, but if we know anything about history, it was mostly women who had to put up with all of this shit. There was the first standard ducking stool, so women would have to, sit in this chair, strap themselves down while sitting outside their houses or, whatever. They get carried down the street. Humiliation at its finest. That was the main key here, where you'd, come out and go, shame, shame for 46 minutes and then go back inside. That was your day back in medieval times. They had sex. Can you believe that? It's disgusting. Let's take the day off work and embarrass them and make signs. The second version of the ducking stool was essentially the same thing, only it was then dunked into a river over and over again to cool her immoderate heat. Yeah, we gotta cool these witches down. Great. I wonder where all these people, did they not realize where they came from? This is the dumbest. At least that's what French writer Francois Maximilien Mission says. They should cool off all of those angry villagers instead. They should dip them in the river. They're the ones burning with rage because somebody over here is getting some and they're not. Number 1, meowing nuns. If I'm not gonna talk about this one now, then I'm not sure when I'll get the chance to talk about it again. Back in the Middle Ages, a group of nuns were doing their, COVID nun thing, as so many people did apparently back in. And this was odd in the Middle Ages because these nuns would have meowing sessions. Yeah, they wouldn't curse individuals, they wouldn't curse any long sea voyages. No, they would just gather around and meow all at the same time. The French convent, large might I add, many of nuns here, they would spend hours meowing in sync. They'd be like, meow. It would annoy nearby civilians so much that eventually soldiers had to come in and just beg them to stop. They're like, please stop meowing. I don't know why you're meowing, but please stop. For most of these cases, most likely not witchcraft. This one here with the meowing nuns, I don't know. I think that was actually, something was afoot. That was actually a curse. Either that or it's the greatest prank in history. Either way, we have to finish on a nice happier note, dare I say.